Okay. Today, we explore a story that takes me back to my Sunday school days. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And just by the smiles on the faces, I can kind of tell those of you who were raised in a church that had Sunday school. I want you to try to picture the flannel board in your mind with the little fiery furnace. For those of you who did not get raised in Sunday school, it may have looked something like this. So, Chris, yeah, there you go. There's your little flannel board, right? It's fascinating for me as a pastor of 51 to now re-examine some of these stories, these seminal stories that capture our imagination. And I'm always surprised when I push past the nostalgia how deeply they speak to today's condition, who we are today. I mean, these are ancient texts. So last year we spent a lot of time in the Old Testament. In this series in Daniel, we're there again. The reason why we chose Daniel is because I think it speaks so profoundly to life in American culture today. Recall with me that when we began the series, we asserted that largely the culture in which we live is now a secular reality. Do not think I mean by secular that I'm speaking into political issues such as school prayer or referring to God in our pledges, nor am I referring to the move many are making away from Christianity to agnosticism or atheism. And I'm not thinking mostly of social mores that may have changed. When I say secular, I'm thinking about how largely the dominant culture and idea structures that frame how we think as a culture no longer refer to God in any real way. The educational system, the political systems, the medical field, the sciences, the academic disciplines that surround us, none of them begin from or build from God as the foundation of their field, largely. God and religion has nothing really to say about making laws or doing business or even being in relationships in current culture. As well, in pop culture, you could spend a week watching C-SPAN or the news or sports or entertainment and never really get the idea that a God exists. So largely that's where the culture is. It's this kind of overarching secular reality that doesn't, if God does anything, he kind of haunts it. He's on the margins or on the edges, but he's not the center any longer. So what does it mean for people convinced of the reality of God to live in that culture? What does it look like for a people who see God as the ground of all being to try to live amongst a people who do not share that conviction? That is what Daniel is here to help us to do. But do not think in a culture that appears so thoroughly secular that there are no gods. And do not think that idolatry does not exist as strongly now as ever. Daniel is also going to help us today identify our gods in Western culture, the ones that we are prone to worship. And he's going to ask us if we now find ourselves bowing to or serving or worshiping such God, or are we able to consciously live in ways that stay true to God? So that's what our text is going to talk to us about today. Let me begin by framing the story in Daniel 3. We know this book is written about and by and to Jews living in the diaspora. They are far from home. They are living and working and marrying and having children and dying in a pagan land, far from the land of Judah. They are currently living under King Nebuchadnezzar. He is a great king who literally commands vast territories, includes parts of Africa, all the Middle East, parts of Asia, even into southern Europe. So there is really no reality like that currently that has such a wide swath of influence. He's not so much a king of a country as an emperor of empires. Last week we read the story about Daniel interpreting a dream for this king. And remember, Greg described the statue with the head and the chest and and each represented kingdoms that were coming. And the top of that was a gold face, which represented both Babylon and King Nebuchadnezzar. So this week, it may be no surprise to us that the king commissions now a massive statue but it's not of the rest of the kingdoms, it's of the kingdom of Babylon. And we think that perhaps the face might have been Nebuchadnezzar himself. But the image that he creates in this story is of Babylon, the realm and rule of Babylon. It's, for that day and age, massive. 90 feet tall, 9 feet wide. It's built entirely of gold. It represents the rule and reign of Nebuchadnezzar, the empire, and the gods that stand behind that empire. When it is finished, Daniel tells us, the king called together all the satraps and the prefects and governors and advisors and judges and magistrates and all other provincial officials to come to the dedication of the image he has set up. What you have to understand is he's essentially assembling all the people who have any influence, and we know that every conquered empire, he will bring the best and the brightest and set them up to rule and reign. So essentially, he's gathering the influence over all the empires to one place and one time. This probably represents hundreds of ethnicities, languages, and customs. The new image he has created is designed to be the unifying symbol that all people who are in Babylon and under its influence will now worship. To this vast gathered group, a herald proclaims in verse 4, nations and people of every language, this is what you're commanded to do. As soon as you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither. Now, I love our worship band, but I think we've been underrepresented with the zither, don't you think? Don't know what that is. Lyre, harp, pipe. Where's Mike Gilman? Mike Gilman, it's your job to now find what a zither is and play it for us in our band. So he assembles this massive group of musicians, and it's a signal. And the herald says, you must fall down and worship the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. Whoever does not fall down and worship will immediately be thrown into a blazing fire. Now, several things are going on here. First, in that polytheistic world, it would not have been unusual to incorporate a new statue, image, form of worship, even a new god. That world was prepared to fold in any god that they thought had influence. And so this would not have been necessarily unusual for them. But second, you should see this ultimately as a test of loyalty to the king. Imagine if we inserted into our pledge, I pledge allegiance to the flag and to the president who rules over it. And then having a vast gathering and saying to them, everyone will say this pledge, and if you do not, you will be severely punished. You're getting the idea here of what's happening here. This is a commanded pledge of loyalty to the king. But the punishment is death. You're going to be thrown into a fiery furnace. So at the appointed signal, everyone was to worship the image and thus demonstrate loyalty to the king and the kingdom. And so here we read in verse 7, as soon as they heard the sound of these many instruments, all the nations and peoples of every language fell down and worshiped the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. So essentially, Nebuchadnezzar got exactly what he wanted. This is a unifying figure. All these disparate strands of people that I rule over, we now have one image. When you bow, you're showing homage to both the empire and to the king. But there's one problem. Some of the assembled group, actually a very few, just 3 we read, did not bow. And very quickly these people were reported. Verse 12, but there are some Jews whom you have set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who pay no attention to you, your majesty. They neither serve your gods nor worship the image of gold you have set up. So then why did the Jews fail to comply to this order? Where every other people group on earth was polytheistic, really, as you read the literature, there is no cultural representative of a people that is monotheistic outside of the Jews at this time. It's literally an anomaly. It doesn't exist. Just the Jews. They did not believe in many gods. They believed in one God. They did not worship many gods. They worshiped Yahweh. So they were faced with a quandary. To bow down and worship would be, in essence, to deny their faith and their God, and so they quietly refused. They did not make a ruckus. They did not file an amicus brief. They did not demand their rights. Even knowing what it might cost them, they simply and quietly refused to capitulate. They stood their ground. Now, Nebuchadnezzar, like all strong men, was deeply insecure. And when insecure strong men are threatened, you see fury and bombast and threat and accusation. And Nebuchadnezzar demands that these men be brought to him to give account for their failure largely for their insubordination. He then reminds them, there's an inside joke there, so. Sometimes, when the pastor's preaching, he sees the little side comments between people. Just know that. Just know. Sometimes I see the elbows, and sometimes I see the knowing glances. Okay. He then reminds them, could you please just edit that out of whatever we have? He then reminds them just how much power he has over them. He essentially says, I can have you killed for not doing what I said. What's really interesting is in verse 15, he says this, then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand? By this, Nebuchadnezzar is dismissing their God and denying that their God has any real power in the land. In other words, he's mockingly saying, what can your God do here? You're in Babylon. If your God exists, he's far away. He cannot stay my hand. This is a power struggle. Now, before we get to their response, let us return to something I asserted at the beginning. That is that even in a culture as seemingly secular as ours, we do not lack for our own pantheon of gods. Greg referred to this last week, and I thought it might be good to name some of these gods and think about them and how they affect us ourselves. Each of these gods in current culture also deny the God we worship has any real power or control here. We might first name one dominant American god as being the god of consumption. This god says that we exist to consume, that consuming brings happiness, and that in consuming, we need not care for our neighbor or the earth. Our needs are tantamount. The temple of this god used to be the mall, but now it's Amazon. Amazon says to us, there is no need that cannot be satisfied if you simply drop your quarter into the machine and pull the slot. It's ubiquitous. It's always there. You never need to go without. We might name another dominant American god, and this is the god of hyper-individualism. This god teaches me that no one can tell me who I am, that I am the ultimate authority, that my needs are paramount and my rights are always most important. It tells me that I am self-determined and self-determining. I am, in essence, the master of my fate, says this God. It tells me that what I say via social media deserves to be heard and trumpeted. The center of the universe should revolve around me. That's what this God tells me. We could go on to name others. These could be gods in their own right or shades of one's name. We might name the God of happiness that tells me I should always be entertained and stimulated. You can see this as being one of the biggest problems with a generation now being raised with technology. It is almost a fundamental right that I should never be bored. The gods of beauty or power beckoning me to the gym or to the plastic surgeon or the makeup party or the diet as a way to secure my youth forever. None of those things are wrong, but the inherent lie is that you can capture youth forever. You should never get old. We could speak of the god of sex, which I think is confusing and blinding and causing such chaos in culture right now. We could talk about the gods of money or security or achievement that ask us to sacrifice so much to achieve them or to attain them. Each of these gods have their own shrine, their own images, their own temples. Each calls for our attention. Each calls for our loyalty. Each requires our dedication and our worship. Sneaky though, right? We don't have temples and idols, but they're all around us. Each will in their own way deny, dismiss, and diminish the God we worship, saying, "Oh, how quaint. You think your God can protect you. Don't you know it's only your retirement plan that can give you security? Don't you know it's only this political party that will make sure your rights are secured? Don't you know that your fulfillment is only secured through your buying power? Your God cannot protect or satisfy you." What do we say to these gods? Well, here these three Jews can help us out. This is what Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego say to the king. King Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we're thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and he will deliver us from your majesty's hands. But even if he does not, we want you to know, your majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of God you have set up. Now, this is an interesting question. Do you think this is a statement of faith or a lack of faith? On the one hand, they say, our God will deliver us, and then they throw this little disclaimer in. But even if he doesn't, we're going to cover ourselves here a little bit. Can I just tell you, I love this response. I think embedded in it is such deep and important theology. These men fully affirm the power of God to save them. There is, I think, no doubt in their minds. And I wonder if they're thinking about how God interacted with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, or with Moses in Egypt, or within the tribes in Canaan, and seeing God's saving power, basically blowing away the powers that be. But in the same breath, they say, that power for God is not our puppet. We do not dictate to him or tell him what to do. We trust him fully, but we do not know in this moment what his mind is, and so we won't seek to predict it. But come what may, we will stand with him. Now, I think they've just given us a roadmap for how to live in this age. When we hear the doctor tell us we only have 6 months to live, when we hear our financial players say our retirement will not be enough for us, when we hear political figures on both sides say, if you don't vote for me, the world will cave in on you, when the news tells us that we are threatened on every side, we say, it is God that secures our existence. We look to him for our salvation, and even if this disease, downturn, threat takes us, we will not turn away from him. Well, of course, this response to Nebuchadnezzar infuriates him, and so he says, I want you to make the furnace 7 times hotter, and let the strongest men throw them in the furnace. Now, 7 times hotter has to be hyperbole. We know that the kilns at that time they got to about 1650 Fahrenheit. They didn't have the technology to make fire hotter than this. Essentially, what's happening here is make the fire as hot as you can and throw them with the strongest men into the fire. And we know that the fire was hot enough to kill all the strong men that tied up Nebuchadnezzar's prisoners and put into the fire. Now, the king expected, of course, the men to be consumed instantly, and so was shocked to see from his perch that not only were they untouched, but a 4th man had joined them in the fire. Now, the little flannel graph kind of gave you a nice picture of Jesus. There is no real reason to see this as a pre-incarnate appearance of Christ. Nowhere in the Bible does any writer name what's happening here as being Jesus in any way. We don't know if it's an angel or a theophany. What we only get is this description by Nebuchadnezzar, the son of the gods, to describe this 4th person. It's a common Semitic phrase to describe supernatural beings. Whatever, somehow God is present in the fire with these 3 men and protects them. Then Nebuchadnezzar reacts as we might expect. He approached the opening of the blazing furnace and shouted, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out. come here." And so Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the fire, and the satraps and prefects and governors and royal advisors crowded around them. They saw that the fire had not harmed their bodies, nor was a hair of their head singed. Their robes were not scorched, and there was no smell of fire on them. What's interesting to see here is Daniel is going out of his way to juxtapose these three men, to show the power of his God to protect them, these men that stood for him, over and against the king's men. The king's men were instantly consumed. But here Daniel says, not one hair was singed, not one thread was burnt, nor did they even smell like smoke. And to this Nebuchadnezzar says this, "Praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and rescued his servants. They trusted him and defied the king's command and were willing to give up their lives rather than to serve or worship any god except their own God. Therefore I decree that the people of any nation or language who say anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be cut into pieces and their house be turned into piles of rubble." This was his come to Jesus moment. You could see his, just as I am, he's falling, tears, crying, and then I'll kill anybody that goes against their God. He's still a strong man, right? We probably think that what he's trying to do now is simply align himself to this very powerful God, right? Don't speak against that God. We want to be on that God's side. He's no monotheist. He just has folded this God in. The question we need to ask is, what application do we draw from the story? Our world is filled with strong men and idols not unlike that world. It may be that we have not seen them or so have not realized that we've bowed to them, and perhaps this is a bit of a wake-up call for us. Perhaps we all need to examine our need for security or comfort or power or recognition and see if there are any ways in which these things have become idols to us. Perhaps we can also see ways in which we've responded to their lies and threats and have responded in fear instead of trusting God. Perhaps we need to identify the ways fear has bound us and led us away from a deep and abiding trust in God. In this Easter season, we're going to be looking specifically at how fear dominates and what it means to be free from fear. I think it's where the rubber hits the road, honestly. You want to know where faith hits the road? It has to look at fear and see it diminish. Or perhaps we just simply allow this story to lead us to reaffirm our dependence on, our reliance on, our trust in the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Perhaps we simply say together today, God, when we hear the cultural music play, when the culture strikes up the band and we see everyone else around us bow, we will stand. Let's stand together. As we stand now together, we prepare our hearts for communion. Is there any better way to close our corporate worship than to stand up for God by taking the bread and the cup and declaring together the saving work of Christ through his death and resurrection? How absurd to trust in such things. How bizarre to believe that God meets us in this act of faith. How quaint to believe the act itself grounds our being and deepens our faith and strengthens us to live as Christians. It's silly, laughable in the eyes of the culture. Pat us on the head. But each week we get to silence the voices of the secular and idolatrous culture and stand for God, saying, there is nothing more you can say or do to make me deny Jesus in this moment. There's nothing that would make me bow. So in your own way, as we take communion together, silence those gods and throw off the shackle of fear and come in faith and stand for God by receiving. As you feel ready, come receive the elements. If you want to lay your burdens down by lighting a candle, please do that. This is our space to linger, to meet with God, to receive God in this act of faith. Come as you feel ready.
How deep the Father's love for us, how vast beyond all measure, that He should give His only Son to make a wretch His treasure. How deep the Father's love for us, how vast beyond all measure, that He should give His only Son to make a wretch His treasure. How great the pain of searing loss, the Father turned His face away, as wounds which mar the chosen one bring many sons to glory. Sin that held Him there until it was accomplished. His dying breath has brought me life. I know that it is finished. It is finished. deep the Father's love for us, how vast beyond all measure, that He should give His only Son to make a wretch His treasure. How great the pain of searing loss, the Father turned His face away. His wounds would mar the chosen one, bring His sons to glory.
On the night He was betrayed, Jesus took bread and He broke it and He said, "This is my body." In the same way, He took the cup and He poured it out and He said, "This is my blood." The Apostle Paul echoed the practice in the church to weekly remember and to take, to stand for God, and to recognizing the saving work of Christ. Let's partake together. It occurs to me that we've made our own kind of fire up here. How precious are the prayers of the saints. Revelation describes God as capturing the tears of the saints and the prayers of the saints, keeping them. Profound acts of faith in those in-between times as we wait for God's salvation. So now, may the Lord, who captures your prayers and keeps your tears, who is honored by your willingness to stand for Him, who is there to strengthen you, to give you eyes to see, may that God bless you and keep you and make His face shine upon you and bring you peace. May that God sustain you and strengthen you and give you eyes of faith. May He show you this week ways that you can be salt and light in a culture that desperately needs Him. He is our Father, and by the Son and through the Spirit, He walks with us in this world. Thank you, Lord. Now, bless us, your people. Let us receive full measure, faith, and infilling by your Spirit for this week. We thank you and praise you in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, if you would like some extra prayer this morning, we'll have some people ready to pray for you. Otherwise, turn to your neighbor and offer them God's grace and peace with a hug or a handshake.